Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Anika Zalmi, and I'm the Community Engagement and Gender Equality Specialist from the Ontario Council for International Cooperation. And it is my absolute pleasure that OCIC is co-presenting or facilitating this session on policy advocacy tools and some opportunities to build your skills on policy advocacy in partnership with the Intercouncil Network, the Senate of Canada, the Policy Corner, Youth Policy Advocates, as well as Youth Climate Lab. So with that, I'm happy to get us started. Once again, today's session will be on policy advocacy tools and is part of a larger series that I will share more information about towards the end of today's session. Before we get started, I do want to start with a land acknowledgement, acknowledging that OCIC's office is on the unceded territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. And I personally am joining from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe on Tubro Wampum Belt and Dishwith-Wanswoong territory. And I also recognize that all of you are joining from different contexts and different places across the nation of Turtle Island. And the reason that I want us to start with land acknowledgement is really to not just say and name the Indigenous communities on whose land we live, work, and play, but rather to think through what is our role in being part of settler colonialism, and therefore what is our role in unraveling or tearing down this concept and this legacy of colonization. Recognizing that the land we live, work, play on is the unceded territory of numerous Indigenous communities and nations who have and continue to fight for social justice. So when you're going through this workshop and really any engagement, I invite you to really reflect on not just whose land you're on, but also how you're going to take the information you will learn out of today's session and then apply it to your own work as a social justice advocate in order to show up better as an ally to these Indigenous communities. So essentially, I invite you to really reflect on how we can move beyond words to actions. So just holding a little bit of space, about a minute, for folks to reflect on what this means in their own lives before we move forward. Thank you for holding this space. So I am very proud to actually hand off today's session to be moderated by a young person. So one of the very target audience members of this series. In fact, I am very proud to hand this off to Harshini Ramesh, who is a recent graduate from McMaster's University Bachelor of Health Sciences Honors Program. She is also currently a research associate at the Smart Prosperity Institute. Her work is shaped by a unique multi-sectoral and multidisciplinary lens, and perspective is gained from engagements that span across different health sectors. She's an avid researcher and policy enthusiast, and she looks forward to using her skills and experiences to support communities and transform systems. Harshini is also a member of OCIC's Youth Policymakers Hub, and it is my absolute pleasure to hand the floor over to her. Harshini.
Thanks so much, Anika, for that very kind introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Harshini, I use she, her pronouns, and I wanted to acknowledge the land that I'm joining from. So I'm a settler on the traditional homelands of the Michi-Sagi people, sitting between Treaty 14 and 19. And thank you very much to the person who sort of took time to remember the recent events regarding and surrounding the residential schools. I hope that's something that we can keep in mind and think about today, and also the role that policy has played and continues to play in marginalizing Indigenous communities. So thank you very much for the introduction, and I'll just be moderating the first half of the session. So next slide, please. To give you a bit of a brief overview as to what we'll chat about today, well, we've gone through the sort of introductions, but the first sort of half of this session, or the first 2/3 of the session, will be our incredible panelists. So Judyannet, who will be joining us from the Intercouncil Network, and Naia, who's joining us from the Youth Climate Lab. And after those two folks, we'll have breakout sessions facilitated by YPA Policy Corner members Tenzin and Ruva, who are also on this call, and we'll close off the session. Next slide, please. Before we do get started on everything, we wanted to run a bit of a quick activity and a quick poll with you. So over the last 12 months, we want you to just reflect on how you've been involved in your own community, or maybe been involved with civic action or policy action in any way. So I will hand it to Anika if you could just set up the poll. So feel free to vote. We'll do this for about like a minute. Is there any way to kind of see the answers? Because for me, it's kind of disappeared. Oh, there we go. Very cool. Well, it's really great to see and awesome to see how involved folks are in their community and raising issues. We hope that this session can help you in continuing to do all of the incredible work that you're doing within your own communities. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start off by just introducing our first speaker, who will be Judyannet. So Judyannet works at the intersection of gender equality, civic participation, and digital advocacy. She has experience doing advocacy work with nonprofits in Africa, researching and writing on these areas as well as women's civic participation in Kenya. And currently she's completing a PhD in sociology, doing policy and research work with the Intercouncil Network Canada, leading research at #DefyHateNow, South Sudan, and co-leading the Africa Community Engagement Hub. So it's my absolute honor and pleasure to hand the mic over to Judyannet, and if Anika could share her slides and we can hear from this incredible speaker.
Well, thank you so much, Hashni. Thank you for having me, and thank you for everyone who's joined us. My name is Judyannet, and I am the policy officer with ICN, and I'm joining in from St. John's in Newfoundland, the traditional homelands of the Beothuk. I will start by introducing myself, no, the ICN first, and then myself. Next slide, please. Okay, great. Thank you. The ICN is a coalition of 8 provincial and regional councils for international cooperation that are committed to global social justice and social change. And it's made up of 350 CSOs across the country. And and now that I introduced the ICN, I will go ahead and talk about myself. Slide 3, please. Thank you. Yeah, so my name is Judyannet, as I've said, and my areas of expertise are gender equality, civic participation, and digital advocacy. And I began community development work many years ago now in my undergrad by volunteering in a local NGO that was working with underrepresented children near my university back in Kenya. I have since worked with different CBOs, NGOs, grassroots organizations, youth groups, and a network of young people in various capacities, including volunteering, which I still do, by the way. I've also led, organized, built community, and I also do mentorship, writing and research, and the other things that Hashni mentioned at the beginning. and I'm currently doing some policy work with the ICN. So as you can see, there's been a shift in my work from community-based work to policy. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I now want to talk a little bit about what this shift has meant for me. And I want to talk about the opportunities and challenges that come from, shifting from a more community activist angle to policy space. So in terms of opportunities, I now have access to, different spaces, resources, organizations, and people, which I didn't have before, or which I had different access before. And I also have an opportunity to address systemic issues through policy, which is great and which I'm enjoying. But there are also some challenges and they're big, unfortunately. As we'll see shortly throughout my presentation, policymaking is a complex and intense process, and I'm sure you already know this. And so change takes time, and sometimes it's a bit discouraging to put in all this work and then not see change instantly. Yeah, so that's a challenge. And of course, there are structural and procedural barriers, which we'll talk about a bit later on. And of course, with this new space, and with these different actors that I'm now engaging with, comes a different set of challenges that I will talk about a bit later on in my presentation. Next slide. Thank you. So with these challenges and opportunities, I have found that it's important to remember why I do what I do. And I have followed Nina Simone's example. You can see her quote there that I really like, and I'll just read it out. And so I constantly re-identify myself to myself. I reactivate my own standards, my own convictions about what I'm doing and why. And I would encourage every one of us to do that because I think, when you step into new spaces, you need your commitments and convictions to hold strong. So I encourage every one of us to do that. And now I will move on to ICN strategic directions. So before I get into I want to draw your attention to ICN's strategic directions because they inform all our policy work. And so the project that I will be talking about today works towards these strategic directions. So the ICN aims to inspire Canadians to act as global citizens, as well as inspire decision makers. It also hopes to increase the capacity of member networks, as well as strengthen the council and the ICN itself. And finally, it also aims to deepen and broaden thought leadership in the sector. Next slide. Thank you. Yeah, let's now turn to the fun part, which is policy making. How do we make policies, and how can young people shape policies? How can you shape policies? I think that's the question we're trying to address today. And so I want to take us through the policy cycle. And through the process, I will also highlight areas and opportunities where you as a young person can take action. Yeah, so excuse me. So the first thing is agenda setting. And this is where policymakers come together and decide on the policy issue to be addressed. So we already know there are very many competing issues and challenges. And so policymakers will often decide on which particular ones to be addressed and when. And so what young people can do at this particular point in time is that you can draw attention to policy issues, issues in your community that you feel need to be addressed by policymakers, or that you feel can benefit from policy change. So, and there are different ways to do this. And Hashni's, poll there at the beginning is a good example. You can attend protests, you can sign petitions, you can, do some social media posts, all these things. After you've set the agenda, the next thing is policy formation. And here is where policymakers will propose solutions for the issues raised in the past step. And so policymakers here often will be aiming for a policy that is effective in solving a particular issue at hand. And they will also want a politically feasible policy. And what you can do here as a young person is that you can present your ideas to policymakers. So you can write letters, you can request for meetings. You can also, do social media posts and tag the relevant people. You want to make sure that the people in your community or the people that represent you, they hear your voice and they hear your ideas. So you want to make that known. After the policy is formulated, then the next thing is adoption. And so once we have a policy that's agreed on by the policymakers and it's finalized, it's ready to go and it's ready to be implemented. And here, young people can do different things depending on the kind of access they have. The first thing that you can do is that you can critically analyze the policy to see if, the ideas that you put forward, whether they've been taken into consideration and how they've been included in the policy, right? Because we know that sometimes young people will be consulted and their input won't be taken into account. So you want to go back and look at the policy and see if your ideas have been taken into account. And you can also give your feedback to the policymakers and let them know what you think of the policy and how you think it will, translate into your community, because you're the people in the community and you know your community's needs best. So that's adoption. The next thing is policy implementation, which is super important because now we're moving from theoretical part of it and we're going to the practical part of it. And so, the policy will usually be enacted by different actors, including government institutions or other organizations in the community. And here is where we have a big challenge, because you can have a nice policy on paper, but completely useless in the community, right? So you want to make sure that all these ideas that we passed, that we included in the policy, that they actually translate into actual practical things that work in the community. And we have, I'm sure you also have, of this and have examples of this. We have I will just use this example that we have in Kenya. We have the two-third gender rule in Kenya that is in the constitution, but it's been 10 years now, because the constitution was adopted in 2010. And we're still not complying with the two-third gender rule. So you can have a good policy, but a good policy needs to work in the community. So at this point, we're looking to see how the public receives the policy and what messages are used to communicate the policy. Is the public even aware of the new policy? And so this particular stage needs a lot of political will and commitment, as well as public awareness and resources. And what you can do here as a young person is that you can create awareness, you can host community meetings, you can use social media, and you can incorporate some of the policy aspects in your own work, and the policy will travel that way. So that's policy implementation. The next stage usually is the policy evaluation, which is also equally important. So at this stage, policymakers want to know whether the policy is working, and we have policy analysts or government agencies that will usually evaluate the policy. And so, excuse me, what you can do as a young person is that you can monitor the policy, right? So you want to identify and document the gaps, the challenges, and the missing people in the implementation efforts, and and the conversations and the policy conversations that come out of the policy. So you want to work to see, like, if, for if, for example, there's some resources committed towards making the policy work and the resources are not being used or the resources are not there, then you need to identify that, and that's something you as a young person can document in your community. So that's the policy process. And just before we go on to the next slide, I just want you to pose a question to you, from your experience and keeping in mind your community needs and context. Which stage do you see yourself directing your effort and expertise? Already, I think you're beginning to see like where can you do something. So think about that, and we'll move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I now want to talk a little bit about the factors that that shape policy, and these are many. So I would just highlight a few of the ones I have noted down here. So contextual factors. So be they political, social, cultural, economic, or historical, all these factors play into policy making. And so as young people looking to make to have a voice heard in policy, we need to be aware of these factors and to also understand how they all work together to shape policy. So those are contextual factors, and we also need to understand that what works here will not work in other situations. So just being aware of the different dynamics, I think that's important. The other factor that is important here is actors and their interests. So we must always ask the question, who? So who is on the table and who is not? Like, who is making this policy? Who is being consulted? Who is being involved? And because this one also points to the interests that are represented and the interests that are dominant in policy-making processes. So all this will shape the kind of policies that we have. And so it's important to pay attention to the actors. The next factor there is resources, and this one is, it's an important one, and it manifests in different ways. But one of them is in funding infrastructures. And so, these infrastructures that we have, they determine how resources get allocated to different issues in the community. And so, and what issues get prioritized. So while we're pushing for policy change in the different policy issues that, that you identify with the wider, with the wider policy change issues, like changing how we fund things or projects or processes. So a change in funding structures and systems. So those are some of the factors that shape policy. And I will now move on to a research project that we're doing at ICN, and I will use this to show you how you can use evidence-based approach in policymaking. So this is a project that is just beginning, so just keep that in mind. And so this project focuses on feminist, anti-racist, and decolonial approaches in public engagement. And we're trying to understand how we can excuse me, how we can use these approaches in public engagement. So as I am sure you're all aware, there's been an increase in in awareness and discourses around anti-racism and decoloniality. But what does this mean? And so that's why we felt this is an important research project. And so, well, all this work is important and timely, especially, given what's going on now. It's also extremely important that we be careful as a sector, not to reproduce harmful practices, right? And so with this research, we're hoping to ask and reflect on some difficult questions like, how can we be feminist and anti-racist and decolonial in a sector that is built on and relies on colonial practices and principles? So that's why we have this project going. And Next slide. Thank you. Yeah, so we have a few objectives. I've listed some of them there, but one of the things that we want to do is that we want to assemble tools, tactics, and resources that can inform feminist, anti-racist, and decolonial approaches in public engagement. We also want to document and amplify promising practices among CSOs. And importantly, we want to provide policy recommendations. So that's those are some of the objectives that we have. And next slide. Thank you. And so to disseminate the research findings, we'll hold roundtables and open forums with the council, with the members of the internet of the ICN, sorry. Yeah, and we'll also publish the research findings in a report that will be shared across the sector. And we're hoping to finally hold like a big virtual conference to make sure that we openly share the findings. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So that's the research project. Now, I am sure you're all asking, how does this fit into policy? So I want to return to the strategic directions that I talked about at the beginning to show how this project will inform these directions and lead to policy change. So our approach in this project, which involves CSOs both here and in the South, so our approach in this project speaks to global citizenship. Excuse me, by bringing local and global CSOs together in a participatory manner, we recognize that the issues we face are interconnected, right? And that we are all required to, to direct our efforts and expertise in making in addressing these issues. So in focusing on the interconnectedness of the issues that we face, and coming together to address these issues. The policy recommendations from the research will also inspire decision makers in government, and at least that's our hope. But yeah, that's our hope and aim. And through this project, also the ICN demonstrates strategic leadership in the sector that will shape public engagement in a more ethical way. And I just want to note here that while this kind of work is important, sometimes while it doesn't directly lead to a policy change or a new policy, it also influences procedures and directions that eventually will lead to policy change. So that's all part of the work happening here that will lead to policy change at some point. So it's all important work. Next slide, please. Thank you. And now I want to talk a bit about youth and policing. So I have already touched on this. We now have an idea of, of the policy cycle and the policy processes and where we can act and what we can do. And yeah, but I also want to talk a little bit here about engaging with institutions. So as you already know, institutions can be a bit complex. So it's important for us as young people to know how to engage with them. And so the first thing we need to do is that we need to do our homework. We need to find out like what institutions directly are directly linked to the policy issues that we want addressed, right? What are their mandates? What are their goals? What are their approaches? How are they built? What are their structures? And who are the people in these spaces, right? Because we want to identify the people that we can get in touch with, right? So by doing this and by understanding the institutions that are important or relevant to the policy issues that we care about, we are able to understand the institutional norms and procedures and how to navigate them. And importantly, as I said, we're able to know the right people to get in touch with. The other key thing here to do is that we need to clearly, frame and articulate the policy issues that we're interested in, because I think, moving from a community or an activist, angle, you want to be able to frame your policy issue in a way that speaks to policymakers. And so you need to know the language, right? You need to know how to frame it and how to articulate it well so that people will pay attention to what you're saying. And so when you're doing this, there are a few things that there are a few questions that you need to answer. So you obviously need to introduce yourself and talk about your work and what you're doing in the community. You also need to know to answer the question, what do you know, right? So what do you know about the policy issue? So you need to do your homework, you need to read on it, right? And you also want to know who else is working on this policy issue in your community, because we don't want to be working in silos, which is often the case. We want to create community around the policy issues that we care about. And so we want to know who is doing what, right? So you want to include that as you state as you articulate your policy issue. And then you also want to say, what are your goals, right? And what do you think can be done? Like, what are some of the action plans that you see happening? And then finally, what do you need from these people that you want to, that you're talking to? What do you need from policymakers? Do you need them to, have you on the table as they do the first stage in the policy cycle? Do you need them to to come and talk to your community to get to hear their ideas? What do you need from policymakers? And the other thing is, so these strength in numbers, it's a cliche, but it's true. Okay, so you need to build your partners and networks. As I said, you need to build your partnerships and your networks. So obviously, chances are you already have this from your community work or from your activist work. So you need to engage those very partnerships or even build new ones, and you need to collaborate with them as you push for policy change. So it's an opportunity for you to to engage your community and your partnerships and your networks. You can't do this alone, right? Yeah. And finally, and I think this is the most important one, this is an opportunity to provide strategic leadership as young people. It's a chance to, imagine and cultivate and co-create the present that you want and the futures that we all want. And so, and also as you do that, it's also important, and I just want to repeat this, as I said, it's important to know that you're part of many others that are working towards this thing. So you need to find them and you need to build partnerships with them. That's youth in policy. And now, next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, so I have a few tips. I'm sure you've had many of these, but I would just highlight a few of them. So just as you have your muscle from your, activist work or your community engagement work, you also need to build a different set of skills to enable you to engage with policy, right? So you need to learn the language and the processes and the institutions and the policymakers, especially those ones close to you and those ones in your local area that will directly make decisions that affect you. So you need to know who are those people, where are they working, what are the processes that they're following. And this event today is a good example. So thank you, Anika and colleagues, for gathering us today. You also need to understand the local and national and global politics, especially now when we are all interconnected. And I've already highlighted some of these. You need to understand what's going on beyond your local community. The other thing is you need to, as you're learning the language of policy speak, you also, and aligning and articulating your interests using those that language, you also need to be bold enough to change and shape narratives and policy. So you also need to be bold enough to imagine different ways of doing things. And this is a good example or a good opportunity to do that. You also need to identify people in organizations and institutions that can amplify your work. So that's why I talked about looking at who's working where and who's doing what, because then you can identify people that you can get in touch with. I will also talk about this one, although I think you already did do this. You need to use your digital tools to draw attention to policy issues, and also to hold policymakers accountable, once the policy has been made. Importantly, you also need to recognize that in policymaking, just as in any other venture, there are politics in it, right? And you need to recognize them and identify them, but you don't need to play into it, right? And I think here the commitments and convictions that I talked about earlier, they can be an important guide or something to remind you, why you're doing this and why you're in this policy space. And next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. And finally, and most importantly, I will end with a quote by Samantha Power. And Samantha says, "Do not admire the problem." And so it's easy to get caught up in how bad things are and how mad we all are at the people and institutions that are supposed to be making, working policies or making things better. But that's just a lot of energy, used to admire the problem. And so I suggest instead you focus that energy into some sort of action, and any sort of action helps, right? So instead of complaining, which is great, because that also draws attention to the issue at hand, but you also need to see what sort of actions can you take. Yeah, I think I will end it there. Thank you so much for listening. And next slide, I think I have, I have ICN's Twitter there if you want to, in mine too, if you want to follow us. Yeah, so thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Judyannet. That was so incredible. It was a very clear, practical way. I certainly walked away with a lot of new things that I learned. And thanks so much for reaffirming the power that youth have to be leaders, because they already are the leaders of today. So thanks so much for that. I also wanted to I feel like we could talk about this all day, but I will shift it to the next speaker that we have joining us from Youth Climate Lab. So Naia. Naia is an organizer, a facilitator, designer who lives on the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nations, so-called Vancouver. And currently on a gap year and working with the Youth Climate Lab, Naia has mobilized thousands to the streets through organizing with local and national youth climate movements. She's drawn to climate work by shared visions of a more just world, enjoys climbing trees, and you can often find her engaging with stories in one way or another. So again, it is my absolute great pleasure to hand the mic over to Naia for her incredible presentation.
Thanks, Harshini. It's always funny to hear a bio of yourself read aloud while you're just listening to it. I'm pretty sure a lot of people can resonate with that. But yeah, thank you so much for having me today. And thanks, Judyannet, for that really great presentation. I loved how, clear an overview it was of like the different ways of intervening in policy and also some of the different ways that, youth can get involved. Hello, everyone. My name is Naia. Like Harshini said, I use she, they pronouns. I work as communications coordinator at Youth Climate Lab. And just before we get started, you can go to the next slide, please. I just want to acknowledge again that I am calling in from the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories, also known as Vancouver. And at Youth Climate Lab, we often share this tweet by Indigenous lawyer Naomi Sayers, which reads, "If you are a non-Indigenous person and think land acknowledgements aren't enough, or you want to do something more, start describing your relationship to the land. Where did your family come from? How did you end up here today? And what did you benefit or lose? What was gained or what was lost? And yeah, at Youth Climate Lab, we usually work in the space of climate justice. And so we find that it's really important to be setting our intentions and orienting our reflections around our work in respect to the land. And our work, we recognize, needs to be rooted in our relationship to the land, because it's that broken relationship both with the land and with one another that has led to so much of the climate crisis today. You can go to the next slide. This is a screenshot from nativeland.ca, which is a great way to learn whose land you are on, and it's showing sort of the overlays of the territories and languages spoken and treaties that govern the land. And it's really interesting way of looking at borders, not as something that's concrete or discrete, but something that's overlapping and shows the relationships and the interdependence of nations in so-called Canada or Turtle Island. Go to the next slide, please. Right, yeah, I'll just introduce Youth Climate Lab a little bit for those of you who might not be familiar with our work. So we're a Youth for Youth global organization focused on transformative climate action. So often what this looks like is we are designing, piloting, and/or scaling projects that equip young people to take climate action or to be resilient to climate change. So today I'll be talking a little bit about some of the questions that we've been exploring at YCL around young people and taking action at the municipal level, and sort of some of the bottom-up policy approaches and different things like that folks who are interested in policy can be taking. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit today about why young people can engage with municipal policy and why our perspectives are particularly valuable, some ways that we can influence and intervene in policy making at the municipal level, and then I'll walk you through a few examples and success stories of young people who've intervened at the city level. Okay. So you can go to the next slide. You might be wondering, why should young people engage with municipal policy? So I come from a climate organizing and a climate work background. And so from this perspective, 50% of municipal greenhouse gas emissions in so-called Canada are under municipal control. And so just from a climate perspective, there's a good case for youth to be involved in and pushing for municipal climate action, because a large percentage of emissions are held under the city. You can go to the next slide. At the same time, young people in particular are just generally really well positioned to push for ambitious local action. When young people are worried about their futures, like in the case of climate change, it brings a greater sense of urgency to the table, and it creates often opportunities for conversations around what we owe on a moral and a relational level to future generations, like you might have seen with sort of the hype surrounding Greta and the climate strikes. There's a lot of moral narratives that are being shaped there. At the same time, young people can often encourage folks to think about the shared values that they have and common ground, not only elected leaders, but also organizations and staff who might not normally see eye to eye or might not normally work together will frequently collaborate when young people are leading or are pushing them to do so. And like with the urgency, like I said already, when young people are leading conversations about policy, everyone's idea of what is possible and what is needed both to tackle the climate crisis and just general in our cities expands. And the bigger our imaginations, the more things become possible. The more things that become possible, the better chance that we have for climate taking action at the scale and the speed that science and justice are demanding we do. And just in general, the better chance that we have of pushing our local leaders to be as ambitious as possible. And also it's sometimes impressive when young people show up to policymaking spaces, because folks don't always expect that. And so it can be getting their attention and doing things that, might seem normal to you, but might be impressive to them. And so we'll get them to listen to you a little bit more. And this all goes for all of the municipal policy, not just climate policy. So yeah, this is great, but how do we make it happen? So I'm going to introduce a resource called the Infiltration Manual, and actually I'll just send a link to the chat right now that you can feel free to take a look at. So the Infiltration Manual was developed through an intergenerational approach, both designed by Youth Climate Lab, YCL, as well as Climate Caucus, which is a network of climate-friendly counselors across the country. So the manual itself walks young people through how to push for ambitious local climate action through different municipal channels. And I just want to note that, yeah, we recognize that municipal governments are rooted in a colonial system, and that engaging with government institutions can be both marginalizing and also often dangerous to some communities. And so at YCL, we think as a team of majority settlers, we have a responsibility to sort of leverage our positionality and the relationships and the resources that we have access to in service of thinking about how young people and how policymaking can be disrupting colonialism and extractivism in government spaces. But of course, that's a personal decision, and we encourage you to, as you learn more about engaging with local channels, how that might show up for you as well. So you can go to the next slide. This is the full table of contents from the infiltration manual. And yeah, the full manual is available through the link that I sent, so anyone can use it. It's just in a PDF format. And it talks about everything from how municipal government works, which is really helpful if you're not working in the space of climate, to more climate specific things in terms of like demystifying what climate policy looks like at the municipal level, who has jurisdiction over which emissions, and some suggestions like that. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so these are just some of the basics. This is from the first section of the manual, a resource guide that I put together, just breaking it down even further. It talks about how municipal governments are made up of a municipal council of elected leaders, as well as a municipal administration, so the different staff that work at the local level. These groups are often then subdivided into different standing committees, which is the second image on the slide. And those standing committees and departments are set up by topic. And so they often include members of the public. So that's just one of the many ways that young people, or anyone really, can be intervening in policymaking by joining those standing committees. And together with electeds, standing committees will often review different proposals and will then provide advice to council about how to create motions, and then also which motions should be amended, which motions should be passed, and how that flow should work. And on the next slide, through the infiltration manual, you can also learn a little bit more about how to identify and leverage some different intervention points. I know that municipal governments both seem less scary because there's more local and more and often smaller than federal and provincial governments, but at the same time, they're pretty different in terms of like when electeds meet and how you might be able to engage. And so the infiltration manual really walks you through the different ways that a policy, or really any proposal that you might have for your government, could be adopted or could be considered by council, and then how you might push council to make that happen. I'll talk a little bit about a success story with young people engaging in municipal policy now. So, setting some context, this is a picture in front of Vancouver City Hall in January 2019. And I'll give you some background before explaining what the image is. So in 2018, as with many cities across the country, Vancouver had a municipal election. And there's a group based in Metro Vancouver called Force of Nature. They're an adult organizing group. And they helped to get Christine Boyle, who's the person in the red coat at the front of the image, they helped to get her elected through some organizing. And together, after she was elected, one of the first days in council, they worked together to create and then to move forward a climate emergency declaration. But they weren't sure if it was going to pass. So a group of young climate justice organizers called the Sustainabiliteens were connected with Christine Boyle, and she asked them for help in passing the motion. They worked with a number of adult groups as well as Christine to set up a letter writing campaign, as well as this action, which you can see in the photo was sort of like a climate strike outside of City Hall. And in Sustainabiliteens, we decided that we really wanted to emphasize the distinction between passing and failing. So that's what you can see there, pass it the motion, don't fail our future. We also wanted to create a clear polarization that passing the motion was the only moral option. So going back to what role young people can play in engaging in policy spaces, often we can encourage conversations about what we owe on a moral level to generations. So on the day of the motion being voted on, young people flooded the council chambers after being outside We gave speeches, we went on social media and tagged our electeds, and the motion actually passed unanimously, which is not something that we expected. So we helped make climate action not partisan, and then a lot of other cities across the country in non-Quebec Canada followed suit and declared climate emergency as well. Can go to the next slide. However, that initial motion in January was only symbolic. It was just saying that we were in a climate emergency. However, Christine had written the motion so that staff had 30 days to create a plan for how to actually meet targets. So we mobilized again in May. We wrote letters, we posted on social media, and again, we showed up and we spoke to council. And again, going in, we weren't sure it would pass, but it did, unanimously. You can go to the next slide. So flash forward a bunch of months at this point, staff had been working hard to put together an actual plan to back up both the symbolic motion and then the sort of blueprint or steps that was passed in May of 2019. And so eventually on November 17th of this past fall, we ran a sustained campaign with some of the elements that I already mentioned. We worked with several other groups and just individuals around the city who were concerned about the climate change. And Vancouver City Council approved the Climate Emergency Action Plan. And this was a huge win because right now Vancouver is on track, given that we continue on the same path with the Climate Emergency Action Plan, we're on track to reduce our carbon pollution by 50% by 2030, which is actually like what is needed by science and by justice to be meeting our climate targets. So I'll pick out some key threads of the story just before we move on. One of the big things that was really helpful for us as we were working to pass the Climate Emergency Action Plan was having an elected ally. So Christine Boyle has been incredibly helpful throughout this. Not only is she giving us sort of insider information about what's going on at council and supporting us in taking action or asking us for help, but she's also helping us build relationships with other groups. And so we're building a really strong coalition of folks who are concerned about climate change and working for climate justice in Metro Vancouver. And that's going to serve us not just for city council stuff, but also for the other work that climate organizers are doing in Vancouver. We were also really intentional about wanting to create outside pressure on council. This is particularly a sort of characteristic of Vancouver Council, that they're really susceptible to any sort of outside pressure, but it tends to be the same thing for a lot of municipal governments. So if you do have, a coalition or of other groups who might be concerned about the same things as you, joining together and doing things that put council into the public eye can be really helpful into pushing them to do what you want them to do. So we were able to write some op-eds, which gave us media coverage. We painted a mural like in this picture, which got us more media coverage. And the more that we were able to get into the public eye and to have people understand what was going on and how their concerns about climate change related to what was going on inside City Hall, the more that they were willing to write letters to the councillors, the more they were willing to phone them, the more they were willing to write op-eds in support and speak at council. And so in the end, we were able to mobilize a lot of people who weren't necessarily climate activists just because they were concerned about the different overlapping issues. And the last thing that was really helpful for us was we had a commitment to taking sustained action. So this isn't always possible, particularly if you're just wanting to dip your toes into municipal action. But if you do really want to follow through on something or make something happen at the local level, building relationships with electeds and then sort of pushing them throughout the next few years or throughout whatever elected cycle that they have left within their election time can be really helpful to show them that you're not going to give up and it's not just like a one-off thing that you're doing. Okay, so just talk a little bit about how we can scale those successes. And this is something that we talk a lot about at YCL. How can we learn from the successes that we had in Vancouver, learn from other successes that have happened across the country, and use resources like the Infiltration Manual and our power as young people to mobilize and to leverage our power. So feel free to take a screenshot of this slide. You'll notice that being involved in policy as a young person, and I think this is sort of where I diverge from Judyannet's presentation a little bit, is that I definitely come from an organizing background, and I definitely would encourage you all to not just familiarize yourself with the policy and feel comfortable in policy spaces, but also start to feel comfortable organizing. It often is about getting people in support of a motion, getting people in opposition of a motion if you're opposing it, creating a campaign in order to generate momentum. And so a lot of what I think about when I think about policymaking is not just how to intervene to influence policy, but then how to bring other people with you so that you can really show that there's a broad-based coalition or a large group in the community that's in support, because you're strongest when you have other people on your side. Yeah, so feel free to screenshot this. This is a little bit of a flow for how you might want to intervene in a local policy issue in your community. The infiltration manual talks sort of a lot about how municipal governments are structured and some specific tips for engaging with elected and other allies, but we don't as much cover, tactics for convincing folks once you've built relationships or other ways of getting involved. And so this sort of is a bit of a way to fill in the gap. Yeah, and I'll also actually just share after this maybe a Google document that we've created with some tactics to influence your local government, which just, again, fills in one of the blanks from the infiltration manual. So that's pretty much it for me. Thank you so much for listening. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll take a look at the chat and happy to answer anything. And then, yeah, you can keep in touch with YCL. Our social media is up on the screen. And then maybe I'll send my contact information into the chat as well if you have any more specific questions. I won't be working at YCL for too much longer since I'm going back to school, but I'll be continuing to organize. So if you want advice about municipal action or policy making spaces, I'm happy to always chat. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Naia. It's always such a joy and pleasure to hear from all of the incredible work that's being done from different perspectives, and this underscores how important it is for us to do work wherever we're situated, whether that's from Judyannet's perspective, from the top down, or Naia's perspective, from the bottom up, or anywhere in between. Actually, as we think through how we can take these learnings and then activate them in our own context, I want to invite two of our other Youth Policymakers Hub members and also members of the Youth Policy Corner, the Policy Corner Youth Policy Advocates Group to facilitate a quick roundtable or a quick discussion where you will be broken out into breakout groups and have the chance to start to activate some of these learnings now that you've heard from these incredible change makers and folks, but also as you bring your own lived experience very powerfully and meaningfully into this space. So I'll do a quick introduction and then hand it off to these amazing folks to do a quick orientation about the breakout and then launch you into that. So one of our first facilitators for this is Tenzin Sheksur. She is a first-generation Tibetan Canadian, and she's fueled by her identity and lived experience to center her work around creating ways for underrepresented youth to have their voices heard in policy spaces. She's passionate about issues surrounding human rights, education inequity, and the intersection of labor policy and workers' rights. She holds an honors BA in politics and government and a minor in biology from Ryerson University, and is currently an intern at Yinda Yin Coaching, a local nonprofit organization based in New York City. Sorry, and our second facilitator is Ruva Gwekweriri. She's a passionate, I hope I pronounced that right. She's a passionate grassroots activist with a keen interest in policy and the ways in which activism can affect policy. She holds an honors BA in women's gender and sexuality studies from Laurentian University. Ruva is currently the Community Relations Assistant for Black Lives Matter Sudbury, where she works in creating meaningful relationships between community groups and advocating for policy changes in order to make all citizens safe in the city. So Ruva and Tenzin, I will hand the floor over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Anika. Thank you to our two previous panelists for your amazing presentations. I think we can really learn a lot from them, especially as youth, because I think sometimes we feel stuck in policy spaces. So having a roadmap to be able to engage is so important. I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Nswakamak, aka Sudbury, which is on the traditional lands of the Atikmashing, Anishinaabeg, and Wanapatei First Nations, sitting in here Robinson Huron Treaty Territory. So me and Tenzin are both from the Youth Policy Advocates Policy Corner, as is Harshini. And I just wanted to give a little introduction to that before we start our breakout room activity. So the Youth Policy Advocates Policy Corner is a local chapter in Canada of Policy Corner, and we are working towards providing a policy writing platform and policy skill building opportunities for youth, such as this one. Our mandate covers 3 overarching tenets, wherein 1, youth make meaningful contributions to the policy space. 2, a diversity of voices, perspectives, and lived experiences are represented on our policy issues. And 3, youth work locally to advance global goals. Policy is a broad topic that does not determine the definition in this, that does not have a determined definition in this organization, sorry. We aim to disrupt the policy space by breaking down the traditional idea that only a few key players can participate in policymaking. We hope to provide a space wherein youth can reclaim who gets to be part of policy and have power and opportunity to influence decision-making. So that's who we are. Anika, if you could move to the next slide. Perfect. So what we're going to be doing now is a little activity in breakout rooms that will allow us to apply some of what we've learned in the presentation today. We'll be engaging in a case study of a current political issue in order to better understand how we can advocate for policy. So basically what's going to happen is once you get put into groups, you're going to read through the case study, noting the different policy areas, open up the Jamboard, which we will put we're going to put the link for that in the chat, so you'll be able to access that there. And then you'll discuss the first question in your group, which is, what is the priority? What issues can be addressed and advocated for? And these questions are on the Jamboard as well as at the end of the case study. So you'll discuss that first question within your group, and then you'll put the answers on the Jamboard. And you'll choose 2 subsequent questions out of all the list of questions that are there. And you'll discuss these as a group as well, and then answer them on the appropriate Jamboard. So 1 second, let me put the, I'll put the link to the Jamboard in the discussion right now.
Oh, Ruva, I've already shared it.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So the way to use Jamboard, if you haven't used it before, at the very top, you can flip through the different questions. So you will put your answers on the appropriate page. And on the left-hand side of the screen, there's options for sticky notes or text box, which is how you'll be able to write on the page. So a little overview of the case study before you guys get started. So this is a case study of an issue that's happening now in British Columbia over old growth forest logging. So the logging that's being referred to is in the Fairy Creek watershed, which is on Western Vancouver Island. And you'll see within the case study that there are a number of different stakeholders with different priorities, including environmentalists, the logging industry, and then the First Nations on which this dispute is taking place. So if you'll be able to read some of the overview of the case and the policy and legal responses that have happened in the case study. And then at the very bottom on the last page, you will see the discussion questions that you can answer on the Jamboard. So throughout me and Tenzin will be available to you to ask questions. We'll be hopping in and out of your breakout rooms so that we can help you out with any questions you have. And I think Naia and Judyannet will also be in breakout rooms so they can help you with some of the concepts that you're applying. Yeah. So if we wanted to start with
that. Yep, I will break you folks out into breakout rooms. Just a quick note that breakout rooms will not be recorded. So please feel free to turn on your camera or engage as authentically or comfortably as you would like. So with that, I'm just going to open up our breakout room.
Okay, thank you again, everyone, for participating in the breakout session. And I'm seeing our poll results from the beginning of the activities that we've been involved in over the past year. And if we can quickly summarize some of your thoughts, some of the ideas you've shared with us. So on the first slide, focusing on the issue, what the priority is after reading the case study. I see that in my group, we were talking about what the main priority is. It's protecting the old growth forests in the Fairy Creek watershed area. And I'm also seeing, of course, the issue of Indigenous sovereignty and environmental justices. Priorities, of course, saving as much of the forest as possible. And in terms of long-term impact, protections of land and resources for future generations. So not just thinking about what we have at stake in the time right now, whether it be 5 years, 10 years, but thinking more about the long-term sustainability. So I love these. Okay. So if we can move on to the next slide. Stakeholders. So who is most responsible for addressing the old growth logging? Is it the citizens? Are we talking about corporations, government, whether it be municipal, provincial, or the national level? So I'm saying First Nations, the provincial government. So in this case, it would be the government of BC, logging companies, activists. Oh, and Sarah in my group, she shared corporations will prioritize profits and will most often than not try to evade their social responsibilities. So it is really up to us, activists, community groups, to kind of make them accountable for the actions. And especially in this case, it will be the Teal Jones group. And if you can move on to the next slide, Anika. And the point of intervention. So at which level is political action most needed? Is it the individual, the municipal, regional, national, or international, global level? So I see some people are focusing on the provincial government. Forests are not specific to each city. Premier is also speaking up. So in this case, it'd be Premier Horgan, the Premier of British Columbia. Provincial government, as they're the ones most impacted by any changes, as well as the ones most responsible for protecting these forests. So in the Canadian context, yes, of course, it's going to be the provincial levels because natural resources fall within the jurisdictions of the provinces. And federal governments, as they're responsible for the national response to climate change and thus must hold the BC government accountable. So communicating your message. And we know that in terms of influencing, reaching out to our elected officials, that is extremely important. So being able to kind of create your story, right? How is this issue pertinent to you? How is the issue pertinent to your community members? So in this case, are there ways of framing the issue that could be more effective in galvanizing effective action? So this is probably the most common, is using social media, mainstream media, reaching out to news networks, raising this up in community meetings, meeting with elected officials, so your MP, MPP, your city councilors. And this ties in well with Youth Climate Lab's Infiltration Manual, right? So I've read through it, and it's such a great resource. And kind of, it really does a good job breaking down and demystifying how exactly to navigate the municipal government. And of course, I think Judyannet talked about this, is to work with other groups in reaching out to allies and like-minded organizations, like-minded individuals. So working with other social justice groups under shared values. And okay. So what would top-down and bottom-up advocacy look like in this case? So Judyannet shared her experience working kind of the top-down policy, and really did a great job breaking down the policy making process. While Naia, she talked about her experience with YCL and how they use, they're more grassroots and they use bottom-up advocacy. So I'm seeing in the top-down approach, meeting with high-ranking stakeholders. So this will be mayors, Indigenous leaders, provincial officials. And in the bottom-up approach is communicating with First Nations on how policy approaches or interventions can be integrated sustainably on their land. And if anyone feels comfortable maybe sharing their experience in any type of advocacy work they've been doing or they have done in the past, feel free to do that. And these are some also other ways to take action, particularly for this issue. So in terms of social media, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, you can search up Fairy Creek Blockade and Old Growth Blockade to see what's happening, get updates, see how you can kind of educate yourself on this issue and to participate. And there is also a petition created by Sierra Club of BC. You can email the Minister of, I believe, Natural Resources in British Columbia, Katrine Conroy. And also on one last note, things to think about is, do your actions match up to the concern you think your issue or issues demand? And if I have no other, I guess, participants want to share, I guess, their experience so far, maybe Anika, could we share our slide, our last slide about how folks can get in touch with us, how, yeah, and all our social media channels? Thank you. So these are all of our social media handles. So the ICN, you can follow them on Facebook, Twitter, the Youth Climate Lab, as well as YPA Policy Corner. And we are also currently recruiting. So if you are interested in joining us, please do connect with us on Twitter, or you can shoot us an email. We would love to meet all of you. And Ruva, do you have any last words?
No, I think you said everything. Thank you everyone so much for joining us. Thank you so much again, Judyannet and Naia, for your presentations. And with that, I'll leave it to Anika.
Thank you so much, Ruva and Tenzin, for holding this space for conversation to put our learnings into action. Judyannet and Naia, thank you so much for your expertise and insight. It's always such an honor for me to be able to hold this space and really to amplify not just the incredible work that other organizations are doing, but also the young people that are right at the front lines and who are currently taking their own action in different ways. So this is just a huge thank you for all of you that attended, and I hope that this has been a valuable session for you. A recording will follow up via the Eventbrite. So if you are registered, you will receive an email with the recording available. And I just want to remind you folks that if you enjoyed today's session and found it relevant, that please also mark your calendars for the rest of our series. Last week, we had our first event, which is Activating Youth Delegations, the link to which you should already have received. Today was Policy Advocacy Tools. And next week on Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, we will have a session led by Results Canada in order to develop some skills on how to do grassroots mobilization in our digital context. And following that, we will have a weekend-long hackathon as well as a grant writing workshop to round out our entire session. So once again, thank you all for being here, for engaging, for bringing your whole selves. Thank you to all of our partners for supporting us in curating such an incredible and information-filled Policy Matters series. And we look forward to seeing you again next week at our Grassroots Mobilization in the Digital Age session. Thank you all again and have a great rest of your day. Bye.